1. Why this topic matters now. If there are two forces reshaping the 21st century, they are the climate crisis and the deepening rivalry between the United States and China. What makes our moment so unusual is that these two forces are colliding at the same time in the same policy space. The topic of this video is U.S. energy and climate policy toward China. Competition, cooperation, or decoupling? On paper, that sounds like a very academic question, but in reality, it reaches right into our daily lives. Whether your roof has solar panels, whether you drive an electric vehicle or a gasoline car, and whether your electricity bills go up or down during the energy transition, all of these things are being shaped by how Washington and Beijing deal with each other. At the heart of this story is a simple tension. On the one hand, climate policy and clean energy look like a space where we need maximum cooperation. On the other hand, they have become central battlegrounds in a much wider geopolitical competition. In this series of segments, we're going to unpack how we got here, what is actually happening in the energy and climate arena, and what it means for governments, companies, and all of us who live with the consequences. 2. Basic facts: emissions, energy, and technology. Let's start with a few basic facts, just to anchor the conversation. The United States and China are the world's two largest greenhouse gas emitters. They are also the two largest energy consumers. If you look at global emissions and energy demand, these two countries sit at the top of almost every chart. At the same time, they are also central players on the clean energy side. In wind and solar deployment, in electric vehicles, and in battery manufacturing, the U.S. and China are among the most important markets and producers. They shape global cost curves and technology pathways in a very direct way. That gives us a very simple but harsh reality. Without meaningful action from both the U.S. and China, global temperature goals like 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees are essentially unattainable. No amount of effort from smaller emitters can fully compensate if these two giants move too slowly or move in the wrong direction. So when we ask how the U.S. designs its energy and climate policy toward China, we're not just asking a niche diplomatic question. We're asking what kind of global energy system we're likely to get over the next few decades. Will clean technologies become cheaper and more accessible for everyone? Or will they become more fragmented, more politicized, and more expensive? 3. How we got here, a quick timeline. Before we talk about today's rivalry, it's worth rewinding and taking a quick tour of how U.S.-China climate relations evolved. This is not a detailed history lesson, but a simple timeline can really help us understand the shifts in mindset. For a long time, climate negotiations were dominated by arguments over historical responsibility and fairness. The United States, as an advanced industrialized country, carried a large share of historical emissions. China, as a rapidly developing country, argued that it needed space to grow and that per capita emissions and development needs should be taken into account. In the early years, this led to a lot of mutual suspicion and finger-pointing. Each side worried that the other would either free-ride or demand disproportionate concessions. As a result, global talks often got stuck, and it was very hard to build momentum toward ambitious collective action. But over time, it became clear to both governments that, without some level of alignment between Washington and Beijing, global climate diplomacy would go nowhere. That realization set the stage for what many people now call the honeymoon period of U.S.-China climate cooperation. That's the phase we're going to look at next. For the honeymoon climate partnership and the Paris moment, if you look at the period from around 2014 to 2016, it's almost hard to recognize it from today's vantage point. On climate, the U.S. and China were not enemies. They were positioning themselves as partners and even joint leaders. During those years, the two governments issued high-profile joint climate statements. China announced that its emissions would peak around 2030 and that it would move toward carbon neutrality in the longer term. The United States put forward clear emissions reduction targets for the mid-2020s. The exact numbers were debated, but the symbolism mattered even more than the details. Those signals had a powerful effect on the rest of the world. Many countries have been sitting on the fence, wondering whether major emitters would actually move. Once the U.S. and China stepped forward together, it became much easier for others to commit. That joint movement was a key reason the Paris Agreement could be reached at all. Beyond the big statements, There was a dense web of practical cooperation. The two sides launched clean energy research partnerships, low-carbon city pilots, and energy efficiency projects. There were working groups on everything from vehicle fuel economy to building standards. For a brief moment, climate diplomacy looked like an area where Washington and Beijing could genuinely co-lead. 5. The turning point: trade war, tech war, and trust breakdown. But that honeymoon did not last very long. After 2016, the political winds began to shift. We saw the escalation of a trade war between the U.S. and China, with new tariffs, counter-tariffs, and a growing list of disputes. On top of that, a technology war began to emerge. Key Chinese companies were placed on various lists and faced restrictions on access to U.S. technology. Washington started framing certain industries and technologies as strategic, and Beijing perceived this as an attempt to contain its rise. In such a climate, it was unrealistic to expect climate cooperation to remain untouched. Trust eroded. Mechanisms that had previously worked smoothly were suspended, downgraded, or quietly set aside. Climate issues, which had once been a relatively bright spot in the bilateral relationship, were now being processed through a darker, more competitive lens. This is how we move from a narrative of shared leadership on climate to a narrative of systemic rivalry. And that change in narrative has huge implications for how both sides think about energy, technology, and the global transition. 6. From partners to strategic competitors. What changed in mindset? So, what exactly changed in the mindset on each side? It's not just that a few policies shifted. Deeper stories, deeper mental models began to diverge. From Beijing's perspective, there was a sense of whiplash. China had gone from being seen as a necessary partner in global governance, including climate, to being treated increasingly as a strategic threat. Actions like tariffs and tech bans were interpreted not only as economic measures, but as attempts to limit China's development and lock in an unequal status quo. From Washington's perspective, there was growing concern that engagement had not produced the political or economic outcomes many had expected. China was now seen less as an emerging partner and more as a systemic competitor, economically, technologically, and ideologically. In this new narrative, cooperation in one area was often viewed with suspicion. Would it strengthen a rival in ways that might be dangerous later? Once these mental models take hold, they do not stay contained in one policy sphere. They spill over into trade, technology, security, and, inevitably, climate. What used to be seen as a win-win space, like joint clean energy innovation, now gets reframed as a zero-sum struggle over future industries. Understanding this shift in mindset is key to making sense of today's supply chain battles and the push for decoupling in certain technologies. That's what we'll turn to next. 7. China's green manufacturing machine, PV batteries, EVs. Let's zoom in now on the core of the industrial story. China's green manufacturing machine. Solar panels, lithium batteries, and electric vehicles are three pillars of the low-carbon transition. China has built powerful positions in all three. If you walk into a large solar farm almost anywhere on the planet, there's a good chance the modules come from Chinese factories. If you open up a battery pack of many electric vehicles, you'll often find cells designed or produced by Chinese companies. These are not isolated examples. They are products of a systematic industrial build-out. How did this happen? China leveraged its huge domestic market, dense industrial clusters, and a willingness to invest heavily in infrastructure and capacity. It supported these industries through a mix of policy tools, subsidies, pilot programs, guaranteed demand, and sometimes very aggressive competition on price. Over time, this produced economies of scale that pushed costs down not just in China, but globally. For the world, this has been a double gift. It has made clean technology significantly cheaper, and it has allowed many countries to deploy renewables and EVs on a scale that would have been unimaginable 15 years ago. But for the United States, it also triggered deep anxiety. That anxiety is what we'll examine in the next segment. 8. U.S. fears and policy toolbox. Tariffs, controls, friendshoring. From a U.S. point of view, China's dominance in green manufacturing raises several red flags. One is economic. The fear that domestic manufacturing will be hollowed out by cheaper imports. Another is strategic. the concern that critical technologies and supply chains are increasingly controlled by a geopolitical rival. These concerns translate into a simple fear. What happens if your energy transition depends heavily on hardware produced in a country you don't fully trust? What happens if supply is disrupted in a crisis? What happens to jobs, to industrial capacity, to your ability to shape global standards? In response, Washington has rolled out a range of policy tools, tariffs on solar panels, batteries, and EVs to blunt China's price advantage, trade remedies like anti-dumping and anti-subsidy cases to label certain Chinese practices as unfair, export controls and investment screening to limit China's access to specific technologies and assets deemed strategic. At the same time, the U.S. has tried to rebuild its own industrial base and that of its allies. Through subsidies, tax credits, and procurement policies, it aims to bring more manufacturing onshore or into friendly countries. This is the logic behind friendshoring, not relying on a single global supply chain, but on a network of politically trusted partners. The result is a more fragmented, more politicized landscape for green industries. Competition is no longer just about who has the best tech or the lowest cost. It's also about who can control choke points, shape rules, and align supply chains with political blocs. 9. Competition as a driver. Cost collapse and innovation race. With that background, let's talk about competition as a driver change. It's easy to see only the risks, but there's another side to this story. In some respects, rivalry between major powers has actually accelerated the green transition. If you look at cost trends, the price of solar power has fallen dramatically over the past decade. Battery costs have also dropped, making EVs and energy storage far more viable than before. These declines are not just a result of incremental innovation. They are also the product of a race to scale up, to seize future markets, and to lock in leadership in emerging industries. China invests heavily because it wants to dominate these sectors. The U.S. and other countries respond, not wanting to be left behind. That dynamic pushes everyone to innovate faster, to cut costs more aggressively, and to deploy technologies at a quicker pace. In that narrow sense, competition acts as a kind of high-pressure accelerator. So there's a paradox. The same rivalry that complicates cooperation can also inject urgency and energy into clean technology development. The question is not whether competition exists. That's a given. The question is how to shape it so that it accelerates climate solutions rather than undermining them. 10. The dark side, tariff wars, overcapacity, fragmentation. Of course, competition does not only have a bright side. When it takes certain forms, it can create serious problems for the global transition. Tariff wars, for example, raise prices for end users. Solar panels, batteries, and EVs that were affordable under a free trade regime can suddenly become much more expensive. Some projects get delayed, scaled down, or canceled altogether. For countries with limited budgets, those higher prices can be decisive. Overcapacity is another issue. If every major player builds massive domestic capacity without regard to global demand, you end up with a glut. Companies face financial pressure, margins shrink, and investment cycles become more volatile. Short-term overbuilding can be followed by painful corrections. Then there is fragmentation. If supply chains are split along geopolitical lines, standards can diverge, and systems may no longer be fully interoperable. Projects might have to be redesigned or duplicated to fit different technical or regulatory regimes. That wastes resources and slows down deployment, especially in countries that lack capacity to navigate complex standards. So we have to hold two ideas in our head at the same time. Competition can drive innovation and cost reductions. But if it turns into a chaotic mix of tariffs, overbuilding, and fragmented standards, it can also slow the global transition and increase its overall cost. 11. When climate becomes security, the logic of decoupling. Let's now move into the security dimension. Once an issue is framed as national security, the logic guiding policy changes profoundly. In a purely economic frame, you prioritize efficiency. You buy from the cheapest supplier, build where productivity is highest, and concentrate production to exploit economies of scale. That's how many industries, including parts of the energy sector, became highly globalized and geographically concentrated. But security thinking asks different questions. It asks, what if the supplier cuts me off in crisis? What if this technology includes hidden vulnerabilities? What if my dependence on this source becomes a strategic liability? In the energy and climate space, this has led to the securitization of several elements. Critical minerals are one example: lithium, cobalt, nickel, rare earths. Control over mining and refining is now seen as a strategic asset. Key equipment for grids, storage, and smart infrastructure is another example. If devices can collect data or be controlled remotely, governments worry about potential backdoors and vulnerabilities. Under this lens, decoupling and de-risking start to look rational from a national security standpoint. You're willing to pay more per unit if it means lowering your exposure to a rival's leverage. You're willing to duplicate parts of supply chain in multiple locations if that makes you more resilient. The problem is that what looks rational at the national level can be costly at the global level. Decoupling can reduce efficiency, slow down technology transfer, and raise costs across the board. And for a global problem like climate change, those delays and extra costs have real consequences. 12. Critical minerals and energy tech as strategic assets. To see this more clearly, let's focus on critical minerals and key energy technologies as strategic assets. Think about the metals and minerals that go into batteries, wind turbines, and high-efficiency motors. They are not evenly distributed around the world. Some countries control large reserves. Others have built up dominant positions in processing and refining. This creates choke points, places in the chain where a small number of actors can exert outsized influence. From Washington's perspective, it's troubling if a rival controls key links in this chain. From Beijing's perspective, after a long history of being dependent on Western technology in other sectors, having strong positions in these new chains is seen as a hard-earned advantage. You can see how each side can interpret the same facts in very different ways. The same story applies to certain pieces of equipment and software. Grid control systems, advanced inverters, communication protocols for smart meters. These are not just technical products. They are opportunities to set standards, collect data, and build long-term dependencies. Once you see minerals and technologies as strategic assets, it becomes easy to understand why both the U.S. and China are racing to lock and secure access and to avoid overdependence on the other. But again, what makes sense from a national perspective can generate duplication and inefficiency at the global level, especially for countries that lack the power to shape the rules. 13. The Global South's dilemma, choosing between offers. Now let's shift our focus to the Global South and third country markets. In many of these countries, green infrastructure is not a future concept. It is a pressing need. Reliable electricity, clean transport, and resilient systems are essential for development. Imagine a government in Asia, Africa, or Latin America planning a large solar farm or an electric bus fleet. When they open a tender, they often see both Chinese and Western firms bidding for the project. Behind those companies stand different financing models, different standards, and different political narratives. Chinese offers tend to emphasize speed, cost, and integration. They can bundle engineering, equipment, and operations with financing packages. For a government that needs quick results and has limited fiscal space, that's very attractive. Western offers often emphasize governance and safeguards. They stress environmental and social standards, transparency, and long-term institutional strengthening. Financing may come from multilateral development banks or Western initiatives, with more conditions and more oversight. So these governments face a complex trade-off. Do they prioritize speed and affordability, or do they prioritize governance standards and lower political risk in relations with Western partners? Do they concentrate their bets, or do they try to diversify and balance? This is not a simple buyer's choice in a neutral marketplace. It is a strategic decision that can shape their development path, their external relationships, and their vulnerability to future shocks. 14. Green geopolitics. How third country choices feed back. The choices made by countries in the Global South don't just affect their own trajectories. They feed back into U.S.-China relations and into how both powers design their policies. If Chinese companies win a large share of green infrastructure projects in developing countries, that strengthens China's position in global value chains and norms. It also deepens economic ties and creates long-term dependencies on spare parts, on technical expertise, on financing arrangements. If Western firms and institutions secure more of those projects, that supports their own industrial bases, their standards, and their influence. It also gives them a stronger voice in shaping how the global transition unfolds. From this perspective, third country markets become a major arena of U.S. China competition in energy and climate. It is not just about who has the best technology or the best terms. It is about whose approach to development, governance, and partnership gains more traction. Over time, the experiences and preferences of these countries will shape the global narrative. They will influence whether the world's green transition is dominated by one style of engagement or whether multiple models coexist. And that, in turn, will constrain or expand the strategic options available to Washington and Beijing. 14. Green geopolitics. How third country choices feed back. The choices made by countries in the global south don't just affect their own trajectories. They feed back into U.S. China relations and into how both powers design their policies. If Chinese companies win a large share of green infrastructure projects in developing countries, that strengthens China's position in global value chains and norms. It also deepens economic ties and creates long-term dependencies on spare parts, on technical expertise, on financing arrangements. If Western firms and institutions secure more of those projects, that supports their own industrial bases, their standards, and their influence. It also gives them a stronger voice in shaping how the global transition unfolds. From this perspective, third country markets become a major arena of U.S. China competition in energy and climate. It is not just about who has the best technology or the best terms. It is about whose approach to development, governance, and partnership gains more traction. Over time, the experiences and preferences of these countries will shape the global narrative. They will influence whether the world's green transition is dominated by one style of engagement or whether multiple models coexist. And that, in turn, will constrain or expand the strategic options available to Washington and Beijing. 16. The mixed future, mapping the field and practical takeaways. So where does all of this leave us? Is the future of U.S. energy and climate policy toward China mainly about competition, mainly about cooperation, or mainly about decoupling? In practice, all three elements will coexist. In some areas, especially highly sensitive technologies and certain upstream supply chain segments, we will see more decoupling and de-risking. In midstream manufacturing and markets, solar, batteries, EVs, fierce competition will be the norm. In global governance issues, emissions targets, methane, extreme weather response, some level of cooperation will remain necessary. That means the real question is not, will we have competition or cooperation? The real question is, can we design a system in which competition does not destroy the minimal cooperation we absolutely need to manage climate risk? For companies, investors, and policymakers, I think there are three practical takeaways. First, build geopolitics into your project design from day one. When you plan factories, investments, and procurement for energy and climate projects, treat supply chain and regulatory risk as core assumptions, not background noise. Always ask, if this link breaks, what is my backup? Second, adopt a portfolio strategy in third country markets. Don't bet everything on one supplier, one technology, or one political bloc. Where possible, combine technologies, financing sources, and governance frameworks to keep flexibility and resilience. Third, design what we might call cooperation insurance. Even in a world of rivalry, support data sharing, basic standards alignment, and emergency coordination in low-sensitivity areas. Things like early warning systems, grid stability protocols, and transparent emissions data can serve as minimal safety nets when politics turn rough. In the end, U.S. China rivalry may last an entire generation. The climate countdown is running on the same timeline. At the intersection of these two forces, every decision by governments, businesses, and financial institutions quietly shapes what the 21st century will look like. My hope is that by understanding these dynamics a little more clearly, we can make those decisions, even if only slightly more informed, more deliberate, and more responsible.